Globalisation has meant that consumers in the current era have access to a wide range of goods at cheap prices. But having that range of choice at our fingertips means that our consumer practices are changing, meaning that we're far less likely to repair and reuse old goods and much more likely to buy new things instead. This leads to huge waste issues. There are researchers all over the world currently looking at ways to both prevent and change these unsustainable consumption practices. Over the last few decades, the concept of responsible and sustainable consumption and production has been elevated to a new prominence. Sustainable consumption now has its own dedicated Sustainable Development Goal, SDG12, for which the University of Galway recently ranked 5th in the world in the Times Higher Impact Rankings. The focus of Sustainable Development Goal 12 is to ensure responsible and sustainable consumption and production patterns. Unsustainable patterns of consumption and production are root causes of the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution. And the UN's 2022 Sustainable Development Goals report stated that from 2000 to 2019, total domestic material consumption rose by more than 65% globally, amounting to 95.1 billion metric tonnes in 2019. In 2020, an estimated 13.3% of the world's food was lost after harvesting and before reaching retail markets. An estimated 17% of total food available to consumers is wasted at household, food and service as well as retail levels. These are just some of the challenges faced in this area. This SDG12, is really vital in working to decrease the world's use of natural resources and to minimise generated waste and pollutants. Some specific targets included within this goal include implementing the 10-year framework of programmes on sustainable consumption and production. By 2030, there's an aim to achieve the sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources. Also by 2030, the aim is to halve per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer level and reduce food losses along production and supply chains. Another goal is to substantially reduce waste generation through prevention, reduction, recycling and reuse. As well as that, there's an aim to encourage companies, especially large and transnational companies, to adopt sustainable practices to integrate sustainability information into their reporting cycles. It's really important to recognise that changing our consumption and production patterns is as important to the natural environment as it is for people and quality of life. So we're often asked the question, what is sustainable consumption? For some, sustainable consumption means consuming more of the right sustainable goods. For others, it means consuming goods differently. However, many believe that the most sustainable way to consume is to consume less. To date in Ireland and within much of the EU, attention has really been primarily focused on the consumption of more sustainable products, on more services and more sustainable behaviours. So examples might include promoting A-rated home appliances or grants, for example, towards electric vehicles. However, it's in the combination of maybe consuming differently and in consuming less where we find some of the most radical yet realistic solutions to achieving sustainable consumption. Examples of responsible consumption are wide-ranging. We could talk about repair cafes, food sharing initiatives, but a lot, as I said, of strategies are really based around this idea of consuming more of the correct goods, and they're usually classified as eco-efficiency approaches, whereby a reduction in resource consumption per consumption unit is achieved through improvements in design or production. While improved consumption efficiency is of course part of the solution, it's becoming increasingly apparent that an overall increase in consumption over time can wipe out these short-term efficiency gains. We can see examples of these rebound effects absolutely everywhere. The common example is the light bulb, which has become much more efficient, but we're actually using more of them. Appliances in many households in Ireland have become much more efficient, but these initial savings in consumption are often eaten up by new habits that increase the use and/or of the numbers of domestic appliances in the average Irish household. A policy focus on efficiency is appealing for many people, as it doesn't challenge status quo expectations around quality of life and growth. However, if we are to really meet our sustainability goals, the conversation and indeed policies around consumption among consumers in this country really needs to change, and it needs to change rapidly. To date, policies based on sufficiency, consuming less, and social and cultural changes have really been neglected and overshadowed within Irish and European sustainability discussions. Recent energy research from the University of Galway-led project Energize shows how sufficiency strategies and measures focused on transforming everyday existing practices may present a more realistic opportunity for change. And these are especially effective when combined with a collective sort of re-examination of people's wants, their desires and their needs. To give you one example, we looked at habits around washing clothes in a selection of Irish households. And while awareness of environmental and particularly energy issues has increased and has meant that many households in Ireland over the past 10 years have begun to purchase more efficient washing machines and tumble dryers, householders are also consciously using eco-cycles for washing and drying. However, there's a huge gap because there's no conversation in actually looking at the amount of laundry we undertake and what we actually need to undertake. Why is the average household in Ireland actually doing 6 washes per week? When do we decide that an item of clothing is actually dirty? We are yet to really truly question expectations of cleanliness and social norms and connect them to try and challenge our everyday consumption practices. Released in February 2022, the most recent IPCC report offers an interesting step in the right direction. For the very first time, the report actually contains a chapter, an entire new chapter, dedicated to demand services and the social aspects of climate mitigation. For many social scientists researching environmental issues, climate change and consumption over the past decade, the inclusion of a section on demand was long overdue. Reference to the avoid option within the IPCC report was particularly pioneering for many researchers on projects which have actively called in the past for a spotlight on sufficiency strategies. But what does an avoid option look like? A common example often used to illustrate this sort of avoid, shift, improve approach is transportation. To avoid is to reduce consumption. So in the area of transportation, that might be looking at ways to eliminate private car use through travel reduction, working from home or car sharing. Shift relates to moving from a less sustainable method of transport to a more sustainable one. So think about perhaps swapping your car for a bicycle. In the case of improve, to improve in this example is to increase resource efficiency. So replacing, for example, a diesel or petrol car with a hybrid or electric option. While making the avoid option more prominent in policy debates is for many a big sign of progress, I do acknowledge that a significant drawback of this approach is its emphasis on modifying individual consumer behaviour rather than production processes. We need to be clear that the responsibility to deal with climate change cannot be borne by individuals alone. Across the island of Ireland, domestic consumption levels have increased dramatically during the past 3 decades. Public discourse has understandably focused primarily on minimum levels of consumption, with local and national media outlets frequently reporting on minimum wages and acceptable minimum levels of food, of shelter and healthcare. The concept of maximum levels of consumption, however, has received very little scrutiny despite its impact on us all. If we start thinking about sustainable consumption in terms of consumption corridors, this is an alternative approach that is really gaining momentum over the past few years. And this concept places the association between the good life and consumption at the centre of all sustainability debates. Consumption corridors demarcate this space for sustainable consumption, essentially defining minimum and maximum consumption standards that permit individuals to satisfy their needs and to live a life they value without impairing the possibility of a good life for other people. Corridors of sustainable consumption occupy the space between these minimum and maximum standards. Consumption corridors have the potential to operationalise sufficiency strategies, making it possible for individuals to live better by consuming less and reducing their impact on the environment. Overall, SDG12 is a crucially important goal, as without sustainable consumption, sustainable development is impossible.